Hello there, everyone. Welcome to this latest Author Roundtable. I'm Matthew Turner, as you more than likely know, and I'm joined today by G. Brian Benson, who is a fellow author, several books behind his name, has written both, like me, fiction and non-fiction, and is a huge fan of just incorporating stories and narratives even into our non-fiction world. So I was lucky enough to connect with Brian a little while ago now, and we were both very excited to just jump on this call and start talking about the writing process. I'm keen to hear about yours, Brian. First of all, thank you for joining me.
Oh, no, it's my pleasure. My gosh. And, I'm very interested about yours as well because, we're in the same field a little bit, but yet we go about it differently. And I wouldn't even know how to begin to start something like what you did. You know what I mean? Like a novel. But yeah, it's is awesome.
Well, I wouldn't know where to start on some of yours because you have children's books to your name, and among other things, which is a whole different world for me. I'm always in awe with people who can create stories for kids because it's a delicacy.
Well, thank you. It's interesting. I just I get an idea and I just kind of about a character potentially. And most of my kid stories were written a long time ago before I was ever even sniffed being an author or a writer. And I'd get an idea and I'd write it down, and then I would just kind of make it almost like a mental exercise or a jigsaw puzzle because they all rhyme. And I would just try to kind of put a story together. And more often than not, I get stuck, at the beginning. But some of them kind of kept going. And the two that are in book form now, I've got many others that could be in book form. They're just not yet. I just stuck with them. One I finished, I set it, tabled it after maybe 3 years, picked it up again 6 or 7 years later. I actually got a publishing deal with this app company to make moving picture apps for the one Steve the Alien that I'm talking about. And I signed a contract with them, but then they ran out of money and then the project was on hold. And then I asked them to release me from it. And finally in 2016, I took the bull by the horns and I just self-published it. But it's fun for me to just let it flow. And a lot of times with my spoken word pieces too, a lot of them rhyme, and some will take a little while and some will just come through in 20 minutes. So I almost feel like I'm just a conduit. And
Yeah.
I just try to stay out of the way.
I like that because, as you say, you never know when inspiration is going to strike, and to just go with that flow and to not try and place it in a box where it's got to be this or it's got to be that. It just becomes what it needs to
Yeah.
become. That was kind of like the first thing I really wanted to touch upon because, like me, you've dabbled with both the fiction and non-fiction worlds. There's loads of layers in those worlds, but let's
Sure.
just split it in two right now: fiction and non-fiction. And you've done poetry, you've done the kids' books, you've done non-fiction books. Do you find the process for you is similar, no matter what book project you've worked on? It sparks to life and then it just takes on. Is it similar for both, or do you approach it differently?
No, they're very, very similar. I'm not, and I was going to ask you this question later, but maybe you can answer it after I answer this.
Yeah.
I'm not really a consistent sit down every day writer and see what comes up to try to get the process going. I can only do it when I feel inspired.
Okay.
So my first book happened out of nowhere before I even knew I could write, and it was done kind of like even before I realized what happened. I've always tried to be the best version of myself, and way back like in 2007 or 8, I was contemplating leaving my family business, and I was feeling burnt out and like I wasn't growing there anymore. And I sat down one day to write 5 things down that I knew that would help keep me in balance. And I wrote them down, put them on a piece of paper, and stuck it in my wallet. And every day I would just look at the list to make sure I was doing it, and it really helped. And then my intuition just goes, expand the list and write a book. I go, what? But I just then started kind of like writing a whole bunch, some more ideas on things to do to stay in balance. And then the words just kind of poured out under each one. And in a couple of months, I had this little self-help book called Brian's List, like 26 and a half easy to use ideas on how to live a fun, balanced, healthy life. And I found an artist to do a silly drawing of me kind of implementing each one to support each short chapter. And then I just self-published it. And I didn't sell a lot of copies initially because I was shy and I didn't know how to market a book in 2008. But it won a couple of awards, and it just pointed me in this whole new direction. I ended up leaving my family business, and I just kind of kept following the intuitive breadcrumbs. And things started continually happening as I stepped out of my comfort zone. So I know it's a long story, but I just kind of follow the inspiration.
Yeah, I love that. Is it still the case today for you? Or do you try
Pretty much.
to force it?
Yeah, I had my one, I self-published 4 books, and I had one publishing deal, my latest one, Habits for Success. With that, I had a lot of ideas already on what I wanted to do and recycled just a little bit of material and made it better. But after I had the deal, then I had a timeline. And so that was a different experience for me to, like, all right, I got to really knuckle down. And I, locked myself in my room each morning for about 4 hours and just worked on it to get it done. And that was okay, but it wasn't as enjoyable, you know. Are you a consistent writer every day, or what tell me your process, and especially with a novel? Oh my gosh.
It's funny you say, because it's like I've taken the opposite journey to you. I'm a creature of routine. If I want to, and right now, just before we press recording, like I'm in a big, partly for research for the book, but also partly just for my own self, into a big sort of health and lifestyle kick at the minute. And in order to do that, I've had to build like routines and habits into it. And I find that once I get some habits going, I find it easy to do the others. So I'm a creature of routine. Once I find some routines that get me rooted into my day, that's when I can become my best self. But it can also create a bit of a monster, because I get too fixated on doing the thing. I get too fixated on ticking the box, so that I am doing it for the sake of doing it. And I say that because that's how I often approached my writing. Like, writing for me began similar to you, very organically. It was on the back of a rough breakup, and I turned to it as a form of therapy. And almost immediately, I developed this story, this set of characters, this arc, if you will. And I knew that journaling wouldn't suffice for me. I needed to really kind of bring this story to life. And I would kind of do it in a very structured way. Sit down and write a chapter in the evening after tea for a while. And that's kind of where it was. But it was comforting for me because it was part of a routine, and it really served a very specific purpose for me to, kind of get over this really rough breakup.
Probably helped you heal.
Yeah, it did. It was part of a process for sure. And there's a whole story in and around that book where I would leave it and revisit and leave it. So it was a comforting thing for many a year. When I ended up really committing to the world of writing, and one book became 2, became 3, I became too fixated on it. So I would have it in my diary of, I need to be working on a book. And for a lot of the times, I always made myself work on both a novel and a nonfiction book. So my world was constantly competing. I would beat myself up if I sat down and was like, I've got a session to write chapter 8 and structure chapter 9 today. And then if I got to the end of it and I'd not done that, I'd be like, what am I going to do? So I was too structured. I was someone who, the ideas would come organically, but then once I mapped it out and created the structure, I'd become too forced. I'd force it out, and it adds pressure to things. Now, and this really started when I was writing my last book, Beyond the Pale, I tried to just let
Which
go.
I'm loving.
Thank you very much. Yeah. I was so glad to hear that it arrived safe and sound and that you enjoyed the opening. And for me, because I started writing Beyond the Pale when Imogen, my daughter, who just turned 5 last week, she was just a few months old. So almost 5 years ago is when I started writing Beyond the Pale, and I just could not commit to consistency. So I forced myself to just let go, and to just, if this takes longer than it's going to take, and I would ideally like it to be, that is absolutely fine. If I write a few chapters and then have to step away from a couple of weeks, that'll be fine. If this takes a year to write, 18 months, 2 years, it is fine. And I found it a much more enjoyable process. I found it difficult because it was outside of my comfort zone. I had to just let go of control and just go with the flow. But it's exactly the same thing which I'm now, and I'm working on its sequel, Beyond the Horizon, where
Nice.
I came up with the idea and I structured it out over a year ago now, is when I started the process. And I wanted to get started on it because in my mind, I was like, okay, Beyond the Pale's out now. I've done the initial marketing. I need to be working on the next book. And indeed, I have been working on it in that time, doing the research, doing experimentation, doing some interviews and things. But I have just not been in the right frame of mind to properly commit to it in a creative sense. So I knew that if I'd forced myself to start writing it, 10 months ago, not only would it be not as good, I would be hating the process. I wouldn't have the time, so I'd just be too busy. So again, I've forced myself to I don't need to start writing it right now. It's
Good
fine.
for you. That's tough. I mean, it's tough because you feel pressure to kind of keep the ball rolling, I would imagine. And
Yeah.
I got some questions about Beyond the Pale. Is any of that from your own personal life that you kind of incorporated?
Yeah. I mean, Ferdinand as a character is very different to me.
Okay.
Obviously, the journey he's been on, his sort of major characteristics, were not very aligned. He's very much a work of fiction. But a lot of the questions that he asks and a lot of the, I suppose, demons within, they're things that we share. I mean, the one thing all my books have in common is they're born out of usually some very existential big picture question that is just preying on me. And I commit to a book in order to really figure it out. That's how I kind of figure out and grow. So, in a sense, within Ferdinand and myself have taken a side-by-side journey with one another. And they'll be exactly the same in Beyond the Horizon. A lot of the stuff which I'm doing at the minute is very sort of method acting like. I'm doing a lot of the things which are going to appear in the book to have gone through it, but I'll be repurposing it in a way where it's very much for Ferdinand. So we're aligned and there's characteristics that we share, but as people, as personalities, as individuals, very different.
Okay. No, that's interesting. What kind of research did you do for Beyond the Pale?
Well, thankfully, I'd spent several years writing my previous book, the nonfiction book called The Success Mistake, which spurned a lot of the ideas for Beyond the Pale. So I'd kind of inadvertently been researching Beyond the Pale, at least in a roundabout way, for 5 or 6 years beforehand, interviewing like 160 plus people.
Wow.
So I developed a lot of questions, a lot of patterns, a lot of, just ideas from that, which fed into Beyond the Pale. And then I just started interviewing people who had inspired me on my own journey, many of whom appeared in Success Mistake. So I did some of the research from literally just jumping on a call with them and interviewing them and incorporating their character into the book. Some of my research came in from just my own books that I'd read, that after writing this Success Mistake, it sent me down a rabbit hole of things like habits, which I know is dear to your heart, and mindset and all sorts of personal development. And I aligned with certain parts of it and I questioned other bits. And I mean, I'm sure you can appreciate it, and maybe you can touch upon this as well. Like, once you dive into a topic like habits or anything to do with personal development, it's a bit of a two-edged sword. There's so much stuff, and it's really interesting.
And there's a lot of different ways to present it.
There's so many different ways to present it, yeah. And it's interesting, and there's some great voices in there doing great things, but there's also a lot of, you feel like people are saying what they need to say for the sake of saying it. And I found myself questioning, like, I'm reading this thing and I feel like I have to do this thing because everyone's saying that's what it should be done, but I don't know if it's aligning with me.
Well, just kind of like the crisis that Ferdinand was going through.
Exactly right. Yeah.
That's interesting. There's so many things I could jump on in what you just talked about. Self-help is a very interesting thing. I don't read very much anymore.
Same.
Read a lot, but I think we're kind of similar in that we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to perform and such. And so I found myself, not initially, but the further I got into it, I felt pressured to like take in every word that I was reading, and it wasn't
Yeah.
an enjoyable experience. And not everything in a book is meant for us to hear. We just got to kind of just go in loose and just take what feels right and not worry about the other stuff. I mean, I think as I get older, and it sounds like you're doing the same, we're being easy on ourselves, and we're going with the flow, and we're just trusting the process and not putting all that pressure on ourselves. And it's showing it shows up in all kinds of different ways, as we become more mindful of that.
Beautifully articulated. And you hit the nail on the head, but exactly what I was trying to get across there. Yeah, beautifully put.
Well, thank
I
you.
like I like that. That sometimes, and that was it. I was reading all these books because I felt like I had to read them, and I was trying to consume everything within that book. I don't know. That's where I kind of started to fall out of love with the whole personal development, self-love book world in particular, because I realized that in any given book, and I think this is true for most books, there's only maybe going to be 2, 3, 4, 5% with it that's going to like speak to you, and that's
Yeah.
okay. Sometimes that's all you need, and
Oh
it's
yeah.
about going in and saying, maybe I don't need to go and read this book that has 30 chapters and read all 30 chapters chronologically. Maybe I need to just read the first few, get a flow for the idea, and go, all right, I'm not really vibing with this particular author's voice, but I really am interested in these particular chapters because they seem relevant to me right now. I can always come back to the rest later if I choose. But if
Yeah.
I don't read the whole book, that doesn't make this whole exercise pointless.
Yeah.
Putting so much pressure on ourselves to read for the sake of reading, consuming for the sake of consuming. And I just became obsessed with learning, but I was implementing so little.
Mm.
And that's where it
Yeah,
becomes
it's hard. You
problematic, I
can't take
feel.
it all in. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, that was it.
Mm. I want to take a half step back because I still like when you're laying a novel out. I mean, I wouldn't even. I've done 2 short films that I wrote and stuff, but they're different. They're not. They just kind of came to me in dreams, and I wrote them down. And one's kind of a silent film, and the other is more of a narrative. And so I didn't really do the whole storyboard lay it out process.
Yeah.
Um, do you enjoy the research? Because for me, that feels like, oh, that's the last thing in the world I want to do. I'm more of an intuitive writer. And, some people really do. And it sounds like you've really researched your
Not
books.
really. I don't consider myself much of a researcher. No, I research to kind of fuel the inspiration, I guess. I'm not one of these real deep dive researcher who documents everything. And again, I try to put pressure on myself of doing that, making all these post-it notes. And I just didn't find it all that helpful. I can see
Yeah.
how it does, but again, I felt like I was doing it because I had to do it. For me,
Mm,
research is just trying to stir ideas in myself. So when I interview someone and include them in Beyond the Pale, one of the reasons I loved that was because I was able to implement their actual character into the book. So take AJ Leon, for instance. It's AJ Leon who Ferdinand meets. It's the real AJ Leon who I got to know and I know as a person. So I'm able to
mm,
incorporate his essence into the story. But I took the conversation we had and I just created something completely new. So it's not like I was quoting him. There was a couple of probably word for word quotes in there, but it was
mm,
taking that conversation we had as inspiration to create a scene or two within the
yeah.
book. And I take a similar kind of thing with all the research I do, whether it's an article I've read or a documentary I've watched or a book I've read. I'm not reading them or watching them to try and reference them as such into the story. I'm doing it to try and spark some ideas. So I'm constantly reading and thinking, where
Mm.
would this fit in Ferdinand's little journey? Like, where would
Yeah.
he bring this up? Where would the conversation have? So beyond, after a while, like there's just a mix match of various things. Like then I'll be speaking to another character, whether it's a real person or one that I've made up. And but in one conversation, there may be like little tidbits coming from various subject matter
Yeah.
research that I've done over the course of like 6 months apart. And it's just me not necessarily quoting anything or referencing anything. It's just, that inspired me, like that touched me then, and it feels right to put in this particular place.
Well,
Does that make sense?
oh, no, totally. And I loved the interaction with AJ, how he talked about he wanted to be significant, not successful, because so many people struggle with that success thing because it's been passed down to them one way or another in how, what success means. And it's such a muddled thing that really can do damage to us. And it, to me, just changing that mindset from like, I got to be successful. I mean, well, what does that mean? Money, blah, 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 to being significant and of service. And that just feels so much better, and it just takes the weight off. And so I think that was a really, really, really neat part of the book.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. And AJ is someone who has personally like inspired me for, he's pushing on a decade now, and
Oh, wow.
he's someone who,
So it's a
yeah,
real
like
person, AJ Leon. No, or
AJ
just,
Learn is a real
wow.
person,
Yeah.
and yeah, I met him for the Success and Mistake, and we've met a few times in person now, and shared coffees and good times, and yeah, that was one of the things which he did speak when I had my interview. This idea of significance, but again, none of it was quoted word for word. It was just
Yeah.
taking the essence of that little. I was listening back on it and thinking, yeah, what's the gold in here? And I think that's where, if I try to approach research as a more objective process, where I'm researching here to place literal parts within the book, I think I would hate the research. But I use it simply, I'm researching, like right in recent months, I've been researching a lot of biohacking. And a bit like what we talked about, the self-help worlds, there's a lot of biohacking which I find interesting. And then there's a lot of it where I'm like, it turns me off. I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword. And I went into it just being open-minded, trying to learn some things. And then, okay, which part speaks to me as a person? Oh, that's interesting. I want to experiment with that. Oh, that's interesting. I want to experiment with that. Whether experimenting means actually doing it myself, my own health, or whether just going a little bit deeper down the rabbit hole of reading and watching. But again, none of that is necessarily going to make it into the book. It's all just being consumed to inspire me personally. And then when it comes to the writing part, I just let that creative intuition go by. So I might go in with an idea of a scene where it's going to talk about this, this, and this. But as I start writing, I might just find myself fixating on the first this, and the other two no longer feel important. And then I'm like, okay, that feels right.
No, that's great. I mean, I think it's interesting, even though we're kind of different, we do still kind of operate similarly, via intuition and just flow and inspiration.
I think so.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, for me, it's everything I write about nonfiction wise are just, it's like I'm taking what I've learned and I don't ever tell anybody what to do. I just try to bring awareness to maybe how it's impacted me, or just give people ideas to think and hopefully be inspired, and to hopefully give them permission to maybe take the leap also, that I've taken in different ways. Because sometimes we got to step off the cliff before we know we have the wings to really see what we're capable of, and to really get the flow going and maybe be pointed in a direction we had no idea we were supposed to go, but yet it's so perfect for us. And
well, that's what I was going to ask, because I imagine you had to do a lot of research. You were probably, doing a decent amount of research over the time. And I imagine a lot of it was, practicing it on yourself, what worked for you. But how did you approach the entire, let's call it the quote unquote research process of that book? Because it's a nonfiction book. It was there designed to inspire people to take action.
Yeah, Oh, yeah. I don't. How did I research? I don't know if I did a lot of research. I know that sounds crazy. I've read a lot. I've paid attention. I'm kind of been the observer of my own growth process. Really paid attention to things, and I've had to endure a lot of stuff. Some lovely and wonderful, and some very difficult. But yet, I've always tried to see where the growth is in all of it. And and I guess when I was 3, I told my mom I was here to inspire people. And she reminded me after my first book came out. So I guess I just feel like I'm supposed to maybe be here just to kind of put some positive vibes out there and get people thinking and maybe inspired to kind of look at themselves a little bit more and do whatever that means for them. And so I'm kind of like a presenter of ideas and things that have worked for me. I'm not telling you to go do it. However, so like in my habits book, the last thing I wanted to write was a really boring self-help book. So I kept the chapters fairly short, but I wanted to make sure that it was interesting, that it felt a bit inspiring, and it was also entertaining. And so I always tried to kind of have a story, personal story, or I pulled a few others out that, as far as research goes, I don't know if I researched them necessarily. Maybe they came across me via the news or somewhere else. And I go, whoa, that's really cool. And so I just kept that, I saved it. But I just wanted people to just kind of feel good while I were reading it, and maybe just kind of like you say, hopefully there's 4 or 5 things in that book that means something to them at that moment that they can implement in their life. And maybe, well, actually, shit, if Brian can do it, I can do it, And yeah. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
There's 2 points there. The first one is that is one of the things which drives me as a writer. What you said, if it's just 4 or 5 things in a book, and a lot of times it's just like, if I can just write something where the person reading it just goes away with like one thing that is they're just going to remember, like in a year's time, 2 years time, like it's going to just fuel them to do a something, whatever it may be,
or just get to
because
the next stage in their life, right? And their growth process.
Yeah. Because I've had that. I've had books where I don't necessarily remember the book, but I remember a thing in a book, and I remember
or how it made you
later,
feel.
Yeah, exactly, how it makes you feel, and the actions that it spurs afterwards to just help you make that step. And that's the whole point. That's the whole point, whether it's a book, whether it's a movie, whatever. We're just trying to hopefully inspire people to do something, whether it's a physical or literal something or not. Just hopefully enlightens them in some way. And that for me is like everything. Whether someone loves the book or not, if they just go away with like 1 or 2 things where they're like, that was cool. That got me thinking. That got me questioning things. As you say, we're kind of here to tell people what to do. And I look at it exactly the same. I don't like to approach any book where it's like, do this thing, follow these steps and you'll find perfection. I'm like, I ain't got those answers. Like hell.
No. No, and
But
I think people who try to peddle that, it's a bit egotistical, right? I mean,
absolutely. And I don't have that confidence in myself to do that. I'm like, I ain't here to tell anyone to do anything. But hopefully, by sharing what's on my mind, it may inspire you to, discover something out.
Yeah, I feel like I'm a bridge builder. We're bridge builders, and just, yeah.
And the other thing which I wanted to touch upon there is I love how we seem to come at things from quite different angles. Like you seem very spontaneous with stuff. You remind me of my partner Vanessa, who's loves spontaneity. She struggles more with like routines and things, and I'm the routine guy. Yet the end product, we kind of both take it where we allow the flow to kind of take us. And even though we may have gathered the research in a completely different way, we just allow the things that stick in mind. And we've done the research, whether it was consciously or not. And then when it comes down to sitting and writing that chapter, it's amazing. And I don't know whether you have this happen to you, but it's amazing how often I'll be writing, and then out of nowhere, I remember something that becomes relevant for that particular scene. I'm like, this has made me think about that section in a book, or that documentary I watched, or that conversation I had with whoever, or that story I came across that one time and I have no idea where. And I'll have to then research the story to remind myself what it was. But it came to mind as I'm writing that particular scene, and it comes to mind for a reason. And then it's like, that needs to be incorporated into this chapter because it came to mind.
Yeah. No,
And
I
I
gave
love
you
it when that happens.
I agree. Yeah, no, I mean, we're conduits, we're conduits. I really believe that, and whatever or anybody's definition of God or the spirit or universe is or whatever. I mean, I really believe, we're kind of, when we're being creative, we're connected. And whatever that means. And I don't know. I've had things happen so quickly sometimes. And it's just like, oh my God, where'd that come from? And it's for my growth first and foremost. I'm talking like maybe a spoken word piece or something I tend to write in layman terms, but with depth. But it's just like, that was a gift. They're gifts. And and it's just, I think the more in tune and in balance and grounded we are. I'm very routine in that regard. I mean, staying healthy and, I used to do triathlons and all kinds of stuff. So I'm very routine in my balance, my life balance. But, and I think that really helps a lot. But the more that we're, putting ourselves out there to be creative and grounded, it's just, we can really download a lot.
Yeah. I agree.
That was a lot there.
We've covered a lot, and I feel like we could probably go on for much, much longer and just keep pulling that thread. But before we bring it to an end, I'm curious to just kind of hear a little bit more about like what you've got working on now. Like, is there anything in terms of like the books and stories that you're creating, which is starting to burn inside you and it's starting to come out live?
Well, thanks for asking. It's been interesting. This last year kind of felt very non-creative, although it's been good in some ways. I have a project partner that I got together with, and we put together a compilation book called Dare to Dream, Women and Men Who Refuse to Let Their Dreams Die. And we brought in 15 people to share their stories, people who've always wanted to maybe be an author, or they have a platform they want to kind of use their story to build upon. And we help them write their stories. And it was really unique and different for me because so far it's just been me creating all these different things I've done. And so it was nice in a way because it's made me a better writer. And it was kind of nice working in collaboration with my partner, Paula, project partner, Paula. But it was really awesome to see our authors gain confidence and grow and heal as we help them craft their story. And so that's coming out on February 21st. So that'll be fun, just to be able to share that book for them.
There's something magical, isn't it, though, when especially someone who, I think we all have stories, right? Like we all have stories.
Yeah.
We all have things to share. And I take it for granted because for a good chunk of my life, unknowingly always had a bit of a knack for having the imagination, being able to turn what's going on in my head into something cohesive on the page. I've always had a bit of a sort of flair for storytelling like that. Always had that wild imagination as a kid. For most of my life, I didn't know it. But looking back now, knowing what I know, it's like, oh yeah, that's always been there. But that's not the case for a lot of people. And I take it for granted a lot of the time and there's something special when, whether it's comes out very organically for someone or whether they've been, coached into doing it, like the process you've been doing, and they get to be a friend and they have a somewhat cohesive story where this was in my head and it's been wanting to get out usually for a long time.
Yeah.
And here it is. And the look on their face and the feeling of it. And that's magic. I love that.
Absolutely.
I love to see
that. I'm grateful for having had that experience. Yeah. Because it was just completely different and kind of came out of nowhere, but it's been good for my own growth process. And I've one other little thing that I've been working on. I had prostate cancer a couple years ago. I'm good to go now, but I drove around the US in 2021 for 6 months in a used RV just to kind of heal and just shake out the cobwebs and just really have an adventure. And so I'm working on a road trip memoir about my experience of driving around the US, and it's not going to be a book about cancer, but and briefly kind of what precipitated it. And I have a working title called With Purpose Without a Map. And so we'll see how that goes. But it's been put on hold just a little bit because of this other thing.
Yeah. And how's that process been like? Again, has it been like previously where just as inspiration strikes, you commit to it, or have you approached this one a little bit differently based on past experiences?
Well, that's a great question. Yes and no. It's a little different in that I wrote a daily journal while I was on the trip, and I also did a lot of voice notes to myself that I emailed to myself. And so I have a whole bunch of notes. And so I'm pretty much through with like placing everything in order and such. And I've begun writing and kind of letting just the imagination flow and the inspiration fly on particular events. I'm still not exactly sure how I want to present it, but as you know, sometimes we have an idea about something, but after we begin it, it kind of starts to alter and it shows, maybe the proper way that it needs to be offered. And so I'm open to that,
Yeah, I think it's always important going into a book, particularly because it's such a large project, to have an idea of structure and a map, if you will.
Yeah.
But to not have that become too structured, too rigid, because it will evolve. And that's great. And that's good. As we've talked about already, sometimes you go in with a chapter going, I want to talk about these 3 things. And sometimes you end up talking about none of those things because you start writing and before you know it, you've like blacked out and you've got 2,000 words on the page and you've talked about something completely different. More often than not, that's what needed to come out though. So yeah, it's important to let the flow. If you go in with some kind of idea of what it needs to be, that helps.
Absolutely. I always tell people too, it's probably not as applicable in a novel because I would imagine I don't know how much you lay it out or if some of it you just kind of leave the chance and see where it flows. But when people ask me about like they've never written before and they want to write something, I say, listen, just don't feel like you have to go from A to Z, because just get headings, get things you want to talk about, and then write under them, and then it'll start to show itself. And it takes the pressure off.
No, it's a similar thing with novels. Yeah, you can always rearrange them at a later date. Well, Brian, this has been amazing.
Thank you.
It's been so fascinating to hear your sort of approach. I find it fascinating how we approach things quite differently, yet when we get towards the end process, we're so similar. Yeah. I find that fascinating as a writer because I've yet to meet another writer who does it like me. And that's great. We all have our own little ways of doing it, and I find it fascinating. So anyone who's watching, listening right now, where can we find more information about yourself?
Well, thanks. Just my website's gbrian with an I, gbrianbenson.com. And then my latest book, the Habits book, is just habitsforsuccessbook.com. Habitsforsuccessbook.com. Yeah.
You should check Brian out if you'd like to delve a little bit deeper. Really good. All the best with the 2 projects. Please keep me in the loop, especially with the memoir one. That sounds fascinating and certainly something I'd love to dive into. Anyone who wants to sort of check out my world, just head over to beyondbook.co. It's beyondbook.co. There's all my details on there as well as links.
Beyond the Pale is awesome. I'm loving it. Well, seriously, I'm not just saying that. I am. It's fantastic.
Well, thank you very much. This has been wonderful. And I hope everyone watching and listening to this has found it interesting. Yeah, any questions, please just let us know. Other than that, have a great one and thank you.
Thanks, Matthew.